In 1854, word spread across Louisiana that two enslaved children, Adira, age 12, and Silas, age 11, had vanished from the LaRue plantation without leaving a single footprint behind. By sunrise, their owner had summoned a coalition of planters furious that two small runaways had slipped past traps built to contain grown men. Within days, over 100 armed bounty hunters were crawling through the swamps, convinced the chase would end by nightfall. But it didn't, because each time a hunter claimed to have cornered the children, his dogs turned on him, his boat capsized, or his trail markers were rearranged in ways no adult could explain. By the end of the month, entire search parties were quitting in fear, and the cartel was begging for answers. How did two children outmaneuver 100 hunters? And why did every man who underestimated them vanish first? But let me start from the beginning. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun hung low over the cane fields, bleeding orange across the rows where Adira and Silas dragged themselves toward the quarters. Adira's hands burned from the day's work. 12 hours of bundling cut stalks, her fingers raw and sticky with sap. Beside her, Silas limped slightly, favoring his left foot, where a stone had worked through his worn shoe that morning. Neither spoke. The heat pressed down like a hand on their shoulders, but something felt wrong. Adira noticed it first, deep ruts in the dirt path where no wagon should have traveled today. The tracks curved toward the main house, then circled back toward the slave quarters. Fresh tracks. Recent. She slowed her pace. Around them, adults huddled in tight groups, their voices low and urgent. Old Moses stood with his wife near the well, speaking in harsh whispers. When Adira tried to catch his eye, he looked away quickly, his jaw tight. "Adira?" Silas's voice was small. "Why is everyone acting funny?" She didn't answer. Her chest had gone tight. They rounded the corner toward their cabin, and Adira's world stopped. A wagon stood in the clearing. Not the supply wagon or the cotton cart. This one had iron bars built into its sides. A trader's cart. She knew what it meant. Everyone knew what it meant. Her mother stood near it. Marianne's hands were bound in front of her with rough hemp rope. Two men flanked her, one the trader, recognizable by his stained leather vest and the keys hanging from his belt. The other was Brant, the plantation's new overseer, his face blank and businesslike. Adira's legs moved before her mind caught up. She ran. "Mama!" Brant's hand shot out, catching Adira's shoulder hard enough to spin her sideways. She stumbled but kept pushing forward, her vision blurring. "Let me go! Mama!" Marianne's eyes found hers. For one terrible moment, their gazes locked. Her mother's face was calm, impossibly calm, but her eyes held something desperate and fierce. "Adira, stop." Marianne's voice cut through the chaos. Steady, clear. Adira froze. Silas crashed into her from behind, sobbing. "What are they doing? Where are they taking her?" The trader opened the cart's rear gate. The iron hinges screamed. Brant's grip tightened on Adira's shoulder. "Back to your cabin. Both of you!" "No!" Silas wailed. "You can't!" Marianne stepped toward the cart without being pushed. She moved with dignity, her head high, even as the trader grabbed her elbow to steady her climb. But just before she entered, she turned back one final time. Her lips barely moved. Her voice was a whisper that somehow carried across the distance. "Run, when the night turns quiet." Then she was inside. The gate clanged shut. The wagon rolled away. Adira stood frozen, Brant's hand still heavy on her shoulder. She watched the cart disappear down the long drive toward the main road. Dust rose in its wake, hanging in the thick evening air. When the wagon was finally gone, Brant released her. He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. His breath smelled like tobacco. "Morning brings reassignments," he said quietly. "Master LaRue is reorganizing the work crews. You two will be separated to different sections of the plantation. Easier to manage that way." Silas made a wounded sound. Brant stood. "Get to your cabin. Stay there." He walked away without looking back. Adira sat on the cabin's dirt floor while Silas cried into her lap. She stroked his hair mechanically, her own face dry. She couldn't afford tears yet, not when Silas needed her to be strong. "She's gone," Silas choked out. "She's really gone." "I know. What are we going to do?" Adira didn't answer right away. Her mind was already moving, clicking through details she'd spent years collecting without knowing why. She had always been observant. Too observant for a child, some adults said. While other children played, Adira watched. She watched the guards change shifts every 6 hours. She watched how the north fence sagged where termites had weakened the posts. She watched the sugar mill's drainage system, noticing how water flowed through channels beneath the building's foundation. Last winter, during repairs, she'd seen workers expose a damaged section of the drainage tunnel, a section that ran all the way to the irrigation ditch beyond the plantation's eastern boundary. The workers had patched it poorly, more interested in getting out of the cold than doing thorough work. Adira had filed that information away, along with everything else: guard patterns, weak spots, escape routes. She had never planned to use any of it, but she'd prepared anyway, just in case. Now that day had come. "Silas!" Her voice was calm, controlled. "We're leaving tonight." He lifted his head, his face blotchy and wet. "What?" "We can't wait until morning. If they separate us, we'll never get another chance." "But where will we go?" "Away. Anywhere that isn't here." Silas's eyes went wide with fear. "They'll catch us. They'll hurt us." "Maybe." Adira met his gaze steadily. "But if we stay, we lose each other forever. I won't let that happen." She stood and began gathering what little they had. A piece of dried cornbread wrapped in cloth, a small tin cup, a half-full water skin Marianne had kept hidden under her sleeping mat. Everything fit into a cloth pouch small enough to tie around Adira's waist. Silas watched her move with growing understanding. "You've been thinking about this for a long time." The quarters grew quiet as night deepened. Through the cabin's gaps, Adira watched the guard posted near their section, a young man named Webb who often dozed during the late shift. She'd watched him for months. His pattern never changed. At midnight, his head drooped forward. "Now," Adira whispered. They slipped through the cabin door like shadows. The night air was thick and warm, filled with the chirp of crickets. Adira led Silas between buildings, keeping to the darkest spaces, moving when clouds covered the moon. The sugar mill loomed ahead, a massive wooden structure that smelled perpetually of burnt sugar and machinery oil. They crept along its western wall, then circled to the rear where maintenance equipment lay scattered. Adira knelt beside a section of wall where boards had rotted at their bases. She'd checked this spot 3 times over the past year, always finding it the same. Neglected, forgotten. She pulled. The boards came away easily, revealing a dark opening just wide enough for a child. The tunnel entrance. Silas stared at the blackness beyond. His breathing came fast and shallow. "I'm scared," he whispered. "Me too." Adira dropped to her hands and knees. The tunnel smelled of stagnant water and earth. She couldn't see anything beyond the first few feet. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, Webb might wake at any moment. Morning would bring separation. The trader's cart already carried their mother toward some unknown fate. Forward was terror. Staying was worse. Adira crawled into the tunnel. After a moment's hesitation, Silas followed. The darkness swallowed them both. The tunnel swallowed all light within 3 feet of the entrance. Adira crawled forward on her hands and knees, her palms sinking into cold mud that squelched between her fingers. The passage was barely wide enough for her shoulders. Rough wooden support beams scraped against her back with each movement. Behind her she heard Silas's ragged breathing, quick and panicked. "Keep moving," she whispered. Don't stop. The darkness pressed against her eyes like a physical weight. She couldn't see anything, not the walls, not the ground, not even her own hands stretched out before her. She moved by touch alone, feeling each surface carefully, remembering the tunnel's layout from the winter repairs. The air tasted thick and stale. It carried the mineral smell of wet earth mixed with something sharper. Rot, maybe, or stagnant water pooling somewhere beneath them. Every few feet, her fingers brushed through spider webs. She felt the insects scatter across her wrists, but forced herself not to react. Silas whimpered softly. "I'm right here," Adira said. "Follow my voice." The tunnel curved slightly to the left. She remembered this section from watching the workers. The drainage channel followed the mill's foundation for about 30 yards, then angled toward the eastern irrigation ditch. If they could reach that point, they'd be beyond the plantation boundary. If her hand touched something cold and metallic, she froze. Her fingers traced the object carefully in the darkness. Thin wire, stretched taut across the tunnel at knee height. She followed it with one hand to the left wall, where it connected to something that rattled faintly when she brushed it. Bells. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "What's wrong?" Silas whispered behind her. Adira's mind raced. The wire hadn't been here during the winter repairs. This was new, recent, which meant someone had anticipated this exact escape route and rigged it with alarms. Master LaRue had planned for this. She forced herself to breathe slowly, thinking through the problem. The wire was thin, probably fishing line or something similar. The bells were attached to the wall, likely small brass ones that would jangle loudly if the wire was disturbed. If they tried to crawl under it, their backs would catch it. If they tried to step over it, they'd lose their balance in the confined space and trigger it anyway. "Adira!" Silas's voice shook. "What is it?" "A trap," she said quietly, "but I can fix it." She reached into the small pouch at her waist and found the tin cup. The metal was thin and slightly bent. She worked it carefully under the wire, where it connected to the wall mounting, using the cup's edge as a lever. The wire resisted. She applied more pressure, moving slowly, listening for any sound that would indicate she'd failed. The mounting bracket shifted. She held her breath and eased the wire free from its anchor point. The line went slack. The bells remained silent. "Okay," she breathed. "We can go." She crawled forward, holding the loosened wire high so Silas could pass beneath it. He squeezed past her, his shoulder bumping hers in the tight space. "That was close," he whispered. "Too close." They continued deeper into the tunnel. Adira's arms ached from crawling. Her knees were scraped raw. But the fear of what lay behind them pushed her forward. The tunnel began to smell different, fresher, with a hint of moving water. They were getting closer to the end. Then her outstretched hand met a wall of debris. "No," she whispered. Her fingers explored the blockage desperately. Broken wooden beams, collapsed earth, chunks of what felt like brick or stone. The tunnel was completely sealed. Silas crawled up beside her, his hand finding the same obstacle. "What do we do?" Adira's throat tightened. All the planning, all the years of watching and waiting, for nothing. They were trapped in a tunnel that ended in a dead collapse, with alarm bells behind them and dawn approaching fast. She fought down the rising panic and forced herself to think. The storm. 2 days ago, a violent thunderstorm had blown through, flooding the fields and damaging several outbuildings. The workers had been sent out the next morning to assess the damage. Had the storm caused this collapse? She felt along the debris pile, searching for any gap or weakness. Her hand pushed through a space between two beams, and she felt air moving against her skin. Air from outside. "There's an opening," she said. She pulled at the beams, testing their stability. One shifted. She pulled harder, ignoring the splinters digging into her palms. The beam came free with a grinding sound, and the gap widened. Not much, maybe a foot wide, but enough. "I'm going through," Adira said. "Then I'll pull you after me." She didn't wait for Silas to argue. She pushed her head and shoulders into the gap, feeling jagged edges of broken wood scraping against her arms. Something sharp caught her left forearm and tore a line of fire across her skin. She bit down on her lip to keep from crying out. Her shoulders wedged tight. For a terrible moment, she thought she was stuck, that she'd trapped herself halfway through like an animal in a snare. But she twisted sideways, pushing with her feet, and felt herself slide forward. The gap opened into a wider space. She tumbled out onto soft earth, gasping. Cool night air touched her face. Stars overhead. The smell of swamp water and growing things. They were outside the plantation boundary. "Silas!" she called softly into the gap. His face appeared in the opening, pale and frightened. She reached in and grabbed his wrists, pulling while he pushed with his feet. He came through easier than she had, being smaller, though he gasped when the same sharp edge caught his shoulder. They lay in the mud together, breathing hard. Adira looked around, getting her bearings. The tunnel had dumped them into a marshy area thick with tall grass. About 20 yards ahead, she could see the dark shapes of cypress trees rising from standing water. The grove she'd spotted months ago while working in the far eastern field. "Come on," she said, standing on shaky legs. "We need to hide before they realize we're gone." The ground sucked at their feet with every step. The water rose from their ankles to their knees as they waded toward the cypress grove. Something splashed nearby, a fish or turtle disturbed by their passage. The night chorus of frogs and insects surrounded them, impossibly loud after the tunnel's silence. Adira's cut arm throbbed with each heartbeat. She could feel blood running down to her elbow, warm and sticky, but she couldn't stop to tend it. Not yet. They reached the largest cypress tree and found a space beneath its exposed roots where the water was shallower. Adira pulled Silas down beside her, into the narrow hollow. The roots formed a cage around them, protective, concealing. "Try to sleep," Adira whispered. "I can't." But his voice was already slurring with exhaustion. Adira wrapped her arms around him. Her own eyes burned with fatigue. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest. She let her head fall back against the rough bark and felt herself sliding toward unconsciousness. Just before sleep took her, she whispered a prayer for her mother. A horn blast woke them. Adira jerked upright, her heart racing. Sunlight filtered through the cypress canopy overhead, turning the swamp water golden green. She'd slept longer than intended. The sun was already well above the horizon. The horn sounded again, distant but unmistakable. Then dogs began barking, their voices high and frantic. "They know," Silas said, his eyes wide with terror. Adira peered through the roots toward the plantation. She couldn't see the buildings from here, but she could hear the commotion. Shouts. More horns. The organized chaos of a manhunt beginning. Movement on the water caught her eye. A flat-bottomed boat glided along the narrow waterway that ran past their cypress grove. An old ferryman worked the push-pole, moving slowly through the shallow channel. He wasn't looking their way. His attention was fixed ahead. But he was talking to himself. His voice carried across the water. "Two runaways barely taller than cane stalks," he muttered. "Lord have mercy. They're offering how much? That kind of bounty. Every hunter in 3 parishes will be swarming these swamps by noon." He shook his head and pushed the boat onward, disappearing around a bend. Adira's blood went cold. A bounty. Not just the plantation's punishment, something bigger. Something that would draw men from across the region. She looked down at Silas, saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. This wasn't just an escape anymore. This was a hunt. And they were the prey. Adira's hand found Silas's and squeezed tight. Her mind was already racing ahead, calculating distances, mapping routes, remembering every detail her mother had ever mentioned about the swamps and the paths through them. "We go deeper," she said quietly, "away from the waterways, where the hunters won't want to follow." She pulled him to his feet and led him away from the cypress grove, moving carefully through the marsh, heading toward the darker, wilder parts of the swamp, where the water ran black, and the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. The sun climbed higher as Adira pulled Silas through the marsh. The water here ran darker, stained brown by decaying vegetation. Cypress knees jutted up like broken teeth. Spanish moss hung so thick from the branches overhead that it blocked out most of the sky. Her cut arm had stopped bleeding, but hurt worse now. A deep, pulsing ache. She ignored it. They had to keep moving. "Adira," Silas said behind her, "I need to stop." "Not yet. Just a little farther. Please." Something in his voice made her turn. His face was pale, slick with sweat, despite the morning coolness. He was limping. "What's wrong?" "My feet." He looked down at the murky water. "They hurt real bad." Adira scanned their surroundings. About 30 yards ahead, the land rose slightly, a patch of solid ground thick with ferns. Not ideal for hiding, but enough to get Silas out of the water for a few minutes. She helped him wade to the higher ground. When they climbed out of the marsh, his footprints left dark red marks on the moss. "Sit down," she said quietly. He lowered himself onto a fallen log. Adira knelt and examined his feet. Both were cut badly across the soles and toes. The sharp reeds had sliced through the thin calluses he'd built up from years of barefoot fieldwork. Some of the cuts were shallow, but others gaped open. Swamp water had gotten into all of them. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Didn't want to slow us down." His voice was small, ashamed. Adira pulled her skirt up and tore a strip from her already ragged underskirt. The fabric was dirty, but drier than anything else they had. She wrapped his right foot first, trying to be gentle, but knowing it hurt him. He bit his lip and stayed quiet. She was working on the second foot when a voice spoke from the trees. "Those wrappings won't help much. Not with swamp water already in those wounds." Adira spun, placing herself between Silas and the voice. Her hand found a thick stick on the ground. A woman stepped out from behind a massive oak. She was black, maybe in her mid-40s, wearing a faded blue dress and a head wrap. She carried a woven basket over one arm filled with plants and roots. Her other hand was raised, palm out, showing she carried no weapon. "Easy now," the woman said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Stay back," Adira said, raising the stick. The woman stopped moving. "My name's Selene. I live nearby. I gather herbs in these swamps most mornings." She nodded toward Silas. "That boy's feet need proper tending or they'll fester. I can help." "We don't need help." "You're running," Selene said, not a question. "I know what fear looks like on children. I've seen it before." Adira's grip tightened on the stick. "If you know we're running, why should we trust you?" "Because I'm free," Selene said simply. "Have been for 12 years. I bought my freedom and my children's freedom with money earned from healing work. I don't profit from other people's bondage." She lowered her hand slowly and reached into her basket, moving deliberately so Adira could see. She pulled out several folded cloth pouches. Yarrow for bleeding, comfrey for the cuts, clean moss for bandaging. Adira didn't move. Selene's voice grew gentler. "How long you been walking on those feet, boy?" "Since before dawn," Silas said quietly. Selene shook her head. "Infection will set in by tomorrow without treatment. Then fever. Then you won't be running anywhere." She looked at Adira. "I'm going to set these down here and back away. You can take them or leave them. Your choice." She placed the pouches on the ground about 10 feet away, then stepped back. Adira studied the woman carefully. Her clothes were worn but clean. Her basket showed signs of regular use. Most importantly, Her eyes held something Adira recognized, a deep weariness that came from surviving things that shouldn't be survived. "Why help us?" Adira asked. "Because someone helped me once," Celine said, "when I needed it most." Adira hesitated, then moved forward cautiously and gathered the pouches. She returned to Silas and examined the contents. The yarrow was fresh, the comfrey properly dried. The moss was clean and still slightly damp. She began applying the herbs to Silas's feet, copying the techniques she'd seen the plantation doctor use on injured workers. The yarrow stung. Silas gasped but didn't pull away. "You've done that before," Celine observed. "I watch things," Adira said, without looking up. "I remember. That's a good skill, especially now." Adira finished wrapping Silas's feet with the clean moss, then the cloth strips. The bandages weren't perfect, but they were better than what she'd had before. "Thank you," she said quietly to Celine. "Come with me," Celine said. "My home isn't far. Just over that ridge." She pointed east. "It's hidden, safe. You can rest properly for a few hours." "What if you're lying?" Adira asked. "What if you're taking us to someone who'll turn us in for the bounty?" Celine's face grew sad. "If I wanted the bounty money, child, I could have already screamed for hunters. They're not far behind you." The distant sound of dogs barking seemed to confirm her words. "One night," Celine said. "That's all I'm offering. By tomorrow morning, this whole swamp will be crawling with men looking for you. But tonight, you can eat something warm and sleep without one eye open." Adira looked at Silas. His face was drawn with pain and exhaustion. They'd been running on scraps and fear for hours. They needed rest. They needed safety, even if it was temporary. "All right," she said finally. "But if this is a trick—" "It's not a trick," Celine said. She shouldered her basket and started walking. "Follow close and step where I step. The ground gets tricky through here." She led them through a maze of cypress and oak, following a path that was barely visible. The terrain shifted constantly, solid ground giving way to hidden pools, fallen logs creating natural bridges over standing water. Celine moved with practiced ease, knowing exactly where to place each foot. After about 20 minutes, they reached a small clearing. A cabin stood there, so covered in vines and moss that it seemed to grow directly from the swamp. Smoke wisps came from a crooked chimney. "Home," Celine said, opening the door. Inside was neat and spare. A cooking hearth along one wall, a narrow bed, shelves lined with jars and dried plants, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, everything worn but carefully maintained. Celine set her basket down and stirred the embers in the hearth. Building up the fire, she hung a pot over it and began adding water from a bucket, then vegetables from a storage barrel. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chairs. Adira helped Silas to a chair, then sat beside him. The warmth from the fire felt impossibly good. She hadn't realized how cold she was until now. Celine worked quietly, preparing a simple broth. She cut cornbread from a wrapped loaf and set pieces on the table. The smell made Adira's stomach clench with hunger. When the broth was ready, Celine ladled it into 2 wooden bowls and placed them before the children. "Eat slow," she said. "Your stomachs aren't used to much." Adira took a small sip. The broth was thin but flavorful. Some kind of greens, maybe wild onions. It was the first warm food she'd had since yesterday morning. Silas ate more eagerly, ignoring her advice about going slow. Celine sat across from them, watching with an expression Adira couldn't quite read. Not pity, something else. Recognition, maybe. "Your mother," Celine said after a while. Her name was Marianne. Adira's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "Was? She's not dead." "No," Celine said quickly. "I'm sorry. I meant, I knew her. I know her." "How?" Celine folded her hands on the table. "She used to come to me for herbs sometimes. Said they were for the plantation house. But we'd talk while I gathered what she needed. She was smart, clever, saw things other people missed. She saw everything, Silas said quietly. Yes. Celine's voice grew softer. She did. And she used what she saw. Adira set her spoon down. What do you mean? Selene stood and moved to one of her shelves. She pulled down a jar, but instead of taking out herbs, she reached behind it and withdrew a small folded paper. She returned to the table and placed it before Adira. Your mother was gathering information, Selene said. Plantation records, trade ledgers, names of cartel members, anything that might help the people working to end slavery. Adira stared at the paper without touching it. She was a spy? She was someone who refused to be powerless, Selene said. She'd memorize things she saw in the plantation office, then write them down when she came here. I'd pass them along to others who could use them. To who? People fighting for freedom. Abolitionists, some free blacks, some white folks who think slavery is evil. Selene sat back down. Your mother was part of something bigger than herself. Silas looked at Adira with wide eyes. Mama was helping people escape? Not directly, Selene said. But the information she gathered helped shut down illegal slave trading operations, exposed corruption, made it harder for the worst people to operate without consequences. Adira felt her understanding of everything shift. Her mother hadn't just been a victim. She'd been fighting back in her own way. The sale, she said slowly. That's why they sold her. Selene nodded. The plantation cartel figured out someone was feeding information to abolitionists. They couldn't prove it was Marianne, but they suspected. So they sold her far south where she couldn't cause more trouble. And now they want us, Adira said. Yes. Selene's expression turned grim. They think if they catch you alive, they can use you as leverage. Force your mother to reveal what she knows about their operations, or draw out the people she was working with. The weight of it settled on Adira's shoulders. They weren't just running from punishment. They were caught in something much larger. The bounty, she said. That's why it's so high. That's why there'll be over 100 men searching these swamps by nightfall, Selene confirmed. They want to make an example. Show everyone what happens when you resist. Adira looked at Silas, saw the fear and confusion on his face. She took his hand. We'll survive this, she told him. How? His voice broke. Selene stood again and moved to a shelf near her bed. She pulled down a worn piece of leather and unrolled it on the table. It was a crude map of the swamp, marked with symbols and notations. This shows the safer paths, she said. The places hunters won't want to go. Deep marsh, where the mud can swallow a grown man. Thick cypress groves, where dogs lose scents. Hidden channels that look like dead ends, but aren't. Adira leaned forward, her eyes scanning every detail. She began committing it to memory the way she'd memorized the plantation layout years ago. You can stay here tonight, Selene said. Rest properly. Tomorrow before dawn, I'll give you supplies and point you toward the first safe path. She looked at both children seriously. But you need to understand, this hunt won't stop. They'll search for weeks, maybe months. You'll need to be smarter than all of them combined. We will be, Adira said. She didn't know if she believed it, but she had to try. Selene extinguished the lantern as full darkness fell outside. In the quiet cabin, Adira could hear the swamp settling into its night rhythms, and somewhere in the distance, growing closer with each passing hour, the sounds of the manhunt continued. Dawn light filtered through the gaps in Selene's cabin walls, turning the morning mist outside into something almost golden. Adira woke first, her body still aching from yesterday's flight through the swamp. Silas slept curled beside her on a pallet of woven grass, his breathing steady and deep. Selene was already awake, stirring a pot over the rekindled fire. The smell of hot grain porridge filled the small space. Morning, Selene said without turning around. Come eat. We have work to do today. Adira gently shook Silas awake. He blinked groggily, momentarily confused about where he was. Then memory returned, and his expression tightened with worry. They sat at the table while Celine served them bowls of thick porridge sweetened with wild honey. It was simple food, but better than anything they'd eaten on the plantation in weeks. After breakfast, "We're going into the swamp," Celine said, sitting down with her own bowl. "I'm going to teach you how to survive out there. How to move without being seen. How to find food. How to read the land." "Why?" Silas asked. "I thought we were leaving tomorrow morning." "You are," Celine confirmed, "but you need skills first, knowledge. The swamp can kill you as easily as any hunter can. Maybe easier." Adira ate steadily, listening. She understood what Celine was saying. Running wasn't enough. They needed to become part of the swamp itself. When they finished eating, Celine packed a small satchel with water and dried plants. She led them outside into the cool morning air. The swamp was alive with bird calls and insect hums. Everything felt vibrant and dangerous at once. "First lesson," Celine said, kneeling beside a patch of reeds near the water's edge. "Route marking." She broke a reed at a specific angle, then another one nearby facing a different direction. "See this? The first reed points toward solid ground. The second warns away from sink mud. If you're moving fast and can't remember your path, these markers will guide you." Adira crouched beside her, studying the pattern. "But won't hunters see them too?" "Only if they know what to look for," Celine said. "Most people see broken reeds and think nothing of it. Animals move through here. Wind breaks stems. But these angles, these specific combinations, they're a language." She taught them 5 different markers. One for safe water, one for hidden channels, one for danger, one for rest spots, one for false trails. Silas practiced breaking reeds until he could make each marker quickly and cleanly. Adira memorized the patterns, storing them alongside everything else she'd learned about survival. "Second lesson," Celine said, moving deeper into the swamp. "Food." She stopped beside a cluster of broad-leafed plants growing in shallow water. "Cattail roots. Edible. Filling." She pulled one up, showing them the white root beneath the mud. "Tastes like potato if you cook it. Raw. It's starchy, but safe." She pointed to another plant with arrow-shaped leaves. "Arrowhead tubers. Same idea. Dig down, pull up the root, eat it raw or cooked." They moved through the swamp as Celine identified plant after plant. Wild onions, marshmallow roots, duckweed that could be eaten in small amounts, blackberries growing on higher ground. "And this," she said, stopping suddenly and pointing to a beautiful purple flower, "will kill you dead within hours. Never touch it. Never eat it." Adira made mental notes of everything. Which plants had jagged edges versus smooth. Which grew in clusters versus alone. Which preferred sunlight versus shade. "Your turn," Celine said, gesturing around them. "Show me something safe to eat." Adira scanned the area and pointed to a cattail cluster. Silas identified arrowhead plants nearby. "Good," Celine said. "You're learning." By mid-morning, the swamp had grown warmer. Humidity pressed down like a wet blanket. Somewhere in the distance, voices called out. Not close, but not far enough away either. "Hunters," Celine said quietly. "Likely spread in a wide line, moving south." She led them to a thick grove of cypress trees, their roots forming a natural maze above the waterline. Third lesson, movement. She demonstrated how to stay low, how to use the root systems as hidden pathways. Adira noticed immediately that the narrow gaps between roots were too small for most adults. But she and Silas could slip through easily. "Your size is an advantage," Celine confirmed. "Use it. Adults have to go around obstacles you can go through." They practiced moving silently along the roots, staying below the line of vegetation that might reveal their position. Celine taught them to disturb water surfaces deliberately when they moved, creating ripples that looked natural rather than leaving a clear wake that showed direction. Always pair your movement with natural sounds, she said. Wait for wind to rustle leaves, then move. Wait for a bird to call, then shift position. Never move during total silence. Adira found herself adapting quickly. Her years of observing the plantation, of learning to move unseen between buildings and through fields, translated directly into this new environment. She understood the principle. Become part of the landscape rather than an intrusion upon it. Silas struggled more at first, his movements too deliberate and careful. But Celine was patient, guiding him through each step until his body learned the rhythm. By midday, the hunter calls had grown more distant. The sweep was moving away from this area, at least for now. Fourth lesson, Celine said. False trails. She led them to a muddy bank where footprints would show clearly. Creating deception is as important as hiding. Make them chase ghosts. She demonstrated placing footprints at angles that led toward impassable sink mud, making it look like someone had traveled that direction. Then she backtracked carefully, stepping in her own prints to erase the return path. You can also use sticks to create false marks, she said, showing them how to drag a branch through mud to simulate a body being pulled, or arrange rocks and broken vegetation to suggest a campsite that was never really used. Silas took to this immediately. He seemed to understand instinctively how to create patterns that would draw attention. He arranged sticks in the water to create ripples that suggested movement in the wrong direction. He placed footprints in sequences that seemed natural, but led nowhere useful. You have a gift for misdirection, Celine told him. Silas looked up, surprised. On the plantation, his gentleness had been seen as weakness, but here, his ability to think in layers and patterns was valuable. They practiced for hours, creating false campsites, leaving broken reeds pointing toward dead ends, disturbing vegetation in ways that suggested larger groups moving in wrong directions. When the sun began sinking toward the horizon, Celine led them back to her cabin. All three of them were covered in mud and exhausted. Inside, Celine prepared another simple meal, fish stew this time, with greens and cornbread. They ate in tired silence. Tomorrow morning, before first light, you leave, Celine said. The hunters will sweep this zone within the next day or two. You can't be here when they arrive. Where will we go? Silas asked. North, Celine said. Following the markers I showed you, there are safe houses along the way. People who will help, but you'll need to be careful about who you trust. Adira thought about that. They'd trusted Celine, and it had turned out well so far. But how many strangers could they risk believing? Why are you helping us? She asked. Celine set down her spoon. Her face grew distant. I had a daughter once, about your age, Adira. Bright, quick, full of hope. She paused, swallowing hard. They sold her south when she was 12. Said she was too clever for her own good. Too likely to cause trouble. Celine's voice cracked. I never saw her again. Never learned what happened to her. Silas reached across the table and touched Celine's hand. I couldn't save my child, Celine continued. But maybe I can save someone else's children. Maybe that counts for something. Adira felt a tightness in her chest. She wanted to say something comforting, but no words seemed adequate. After dinner, Celine gave them each a small pouch filled with dried herbs. For infections, for pain, for stomach troubles. Use them sparingly. She also gave them a water skin, a small knife, and strips of dried fish wrapped in cloth. Sleep now, she said. Tomorrow will be hard. Adira and Silas lay down on their pallet. The cabin grew dark as Celine extinguished the lantern. Outside, night sounds filled the swamp. Frogs and insects and distant water birds. Adira was almost asleep when she heard it. A soft sound from across the cabin. Crying. Quiet and restrained, but unmistakable. Celine, grieving in the darkness. Adira didn't move, didn't call out. She understood that some pain needed privacy. Instead, She pulled Silas closer and whispered against his hair. "We have to be strong enough to carry each other," she said. "No matter what happens, we carry each other." Silas nodded against her shoulder. Across the cabin, Celine rose quietly. Adira watched through half-closed eyes as the older woman moved to her shelves and began packing additional herbs into pouches. Her hands shook slightly as she worked. Whether from fear or guilt or grief, Adira couldn't tell. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of morning that made the swamp feel like a living thing holding its breath. Adira woke to find Celine already moving through the cabin, gathering supplies with practiced efficiency. Silas stirred beside her, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Time to go," Celine said quietly. "We need to reach the deeper marsh network before the sweep intensifies." They ate quickly, leftover cornbread and water, then stepped outside into the pre-dawn mist. The swamp stretched before them in layers of shadow and fog, cypress trees rising like dark sentinels from the water. Celine led them along a path only she could see, moving between root systems and hidden channels with the certainty of someone who'd walked this route 1,000 times. Adira memorized each turn, each landmark, storing the information for future use. Silas followed close behind, his steps more confident than they'd been yesterday. The sun climbed slowly, burning off patches of fog, but leaving others intact. Somewhere to the west, dogs barked in short bursts. The sound made Adira's stomach tighten, but Celine didn't change pace. "They're still far enough away," she said. "Keep moving." They walked for hours, wading through knee-deep water, climbing over fallen logs, ducking beneath low-hanging moss. The swamp was beautiful in its own threatening way, all that green life thriving in conditions that would kill most people. Around mid-morning, Celine raised her hand suddenly. Everyone stopped. "Voices!" she whispered. "Close!" Adira strained to hear. There, male voices, rough and casual, coming from somewhere ahead. Celine gestured them toward a thick tangle of bushes and roots. They crouched low, pressing themselves against the damp earth. Through gaps in the vegetation, Adira saw them. 3 men beside a flat-bottom boat pulled onto a muddy bank. The first was broad-shouldered and stern-faced, maybe 40 years old, with a rifle resting across his lap. The second was younger, perhaps 14, with the awkward frame of someone still growing into his height. The third was older, gray-haired, studying the ground with the focused attention of an experienced tracker. "Part of the search chain," Celine breathed against Adira's ear. More groups like this spread through the entire region. The stern man spoke loudly enough for them to hear. "Tracker says they came through here 2 days back. 2 sets of small prints, heading northeast. Could be animal tracks," the teenage boy said. "Could be," the tracker replied. "But I don't think so. Spacing's wrong. Weight distribution's human." Adira's heart hammered against her ribs. They'd been more careful than that. She'd made sure of it, unless the tracker was simply guessing, trying to justify his payment. The 3 men settled down to rest, sharing jerky and water. They showed no signs of moving soon. Celine gestured for the children to retreat quietly. They backed away until the voices faded. Then Celine led them in a wide circle to bypass the hunters entirely. But Silas stopped walking. "What is it?" Adira whispered. He pointed back toward where they'd seen the boat. "The latch pins." "What about them?" "They were loose. I could see it from where we hid. The pins holding the boat's side panels together. They're not secured properly. Probably rushed construction or poor maintenance." Adira stared at her brother. "Why does that matter?" Silas looked at her directly. "If we loosened them more, the boat would come apart when they put it in water. It would delay them. Maybe delay the whole line of hunters behind them." The suggestion hung in the air between them like something physical and dangerous. "That's sabotage," Adira said. "That's survival," Silas countered. His voice was steadier than she'd ever heard it. "If they keep moving this direction, they'll find Celine's settlement. They'll burn it. They'll hurt her." Celine had gone very still, listening. And if the boat capsizes? Adira asked. Someone could drown. Or they could just get wet and angry, Silas said. But either way, it slows them down. Gives us time. Adira felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her. On the plantation, she'd learned to be invisible, to avoid confrontation, to survive through observation and planning. But this was different. This was active interference. This was crossing a line she'd never crossed before. If we're caught, she said slowly, they won't just return us to LaRue Plantation. They'll make examples of us. If we do nothing, Silas replied, they'll catch us anyway, or they'll hurt Celine. We have to choose between dangerous and more dangerous. Celine finally spoke. I won't tell you what to do. This is your choice. But Silas is right about one thing. If they find my settlement, they'll destroy it. I've helped too many people for them to show mercy. Adira closed her eyes. She thought about her mother, sold away, about the overseer's threats, about the 100 hunters searching for 2 children who dared to run, about the tripwire bells in the tunnel, and the massive bounty and the dogs and the guns, and all of it designed to crush hope before it could take root. How would we do it? She asked quietly. Silas's face showed relief and fear in equal measure. I'll need to get close to the boat. Remove the pins just enough that they'll hold until the boat's in deep water. Then fail. It needs to look like an accident. I'll create a distraction, Celine said. Give you time to work. They circled back, moving with agonizing slowness. The 3 hunters were still resting, talking about where to search next. The boat sat unguarded on the bank, its flat bottom gleaming with moisture. Celine moved away from them, positioning herself in the brush about 50 yards distant. Then she began rustling branches loudly, snapping twigs, making sounds that could be a person trying to move quietly, but failing. All 3 hunters stood immediately. The stern man grabbed his rifle. There, northwest. They moved toward the sound, leaving the boat behind. Go, Adira whispered. Silas crept forward, staying low to the ground. Adira followed, her heart beating so hard she thought the hunters might hear it. They reached the boat. Silas examined the latch pins with the focused attention he usually reserved for memorizing Marianne's stories. Here, he breathed, pointing to where metal pins held wooden panels together. And here. His hands moved quickly, working each pin loose but not removing it entirely. The boat still looked intact. Nothing appeared different. But Adira understood what would happen when the weight of 3 men and their supplies stressed those weakened joints. Celine's distraction grew louder. One of the hunters shouted something Adira couldn't make out. Done, Silas whispered. They retreated into the brush, then moved quickly away from the area. Celine caught up with them 10 minutes later, breathing hard. They're searching the wrong direction, she said. We have time. They walked for hours, putting distance between themselves and the sabotaged boat. The sun climbed higher, then began its descent toward evening. Finally, Celine led them to a narrow ridge of higher ground where twisted oaks provided cover. We camp here tonight, she said. Tomorrow we search for what your mother left behind. They built a small fire, carefully positioned so the smoke would disperse through tree branches rather than rise in a visible column. Celine prepared a stew from dried fish and marsh plants. They ate in quiet exhaustion. Night fell completely. The swamp filled with its usual chorus of frogs and insects. Adira was almost asleep when she heard it. A distant splash, then shouting. Male voices raised in anger and alarm, echoing across the water from somewhere far behind them. The boat had capsized. Silas sat up suddenly, his face pale in the firelight. They're okay, he said. It sounded like a question. Probably, Celine said. Flat-bottom boats don't sink fast. They likely just got wet. But we did that, Silas whispered. We made that happen. Adira moved closer to her brother. We delayed them. That's all. We could have hurt them. We could have, Adira agreed. But we didn't. And if we hadn't done it, they might have caught us. Might have hurt Celine. Survival sometimes forces impossible choices. Silas looked at her with eyes that seemed older than they'd been that morning. Is this what freedom costs? Doing things that make us feel sick inside? Adira didn't have an answer for that. She thought about the tripwire bells in the tunnel, about the hunters searching for children to use as bait, about systems designed to make resistance impossible. I don't know, she said finally, but I know we're still alive, and that matters. The fire burned lower. Celine sat across from them, staring into the darkness beyond their small circle of light. Her expression was haunted, distant, as though she were seeing something the children couldn't. The fire had burned to ash by the time dawn broke over the swamp. Adira woke to find Celine already moving, packing supplies with quiet efficiency. The air felt different, thicker, heavier, pressing against her skin like something physical. We leave now, Celine said softly, before the heat makes travel harder. They walked through landscape that shifted from marsh to firmer ground. The water grew shallower, then gave way to mud, then to earth covered in moss and fallen leaves. Fog lifted off the remaining pools in slow spirals, revealing cypress knees and twisted roots. Insects buzzed everywhere, drawn by the rising humidity. Adira felt sweat gathering at her temples despite the early hour. Silas walked between them, quieter than usual. He'd barely spoken since hearing the distant shouts last night. Adira wanted to comfort him, but didn't know what words would help. "Where are we going?" she asked Selene. "An old church," Selene replied. "Abandoned years ago. Your mother used it for something important." "Used it how?" Selene was quiet for several steps. For when the time came. For when someone needed what she'd hidden. They traveled for hours. The sun climbed higher, burning away the fog and leaving behind air so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. Birds called from unseen perches. Once, they heard distant voices and froze until the sounds faded in the opposite direction. By midday, they reached the church. It wasn't much anymore. The structure leaned to one side, its walls half collapsed, its roof mostly gone. Wooden boards jutted at wrong angles. Vines had claimed entire sections, pulling everything toward the earth. But the foundation remained, and part of the floor still held. "Search beneath the boards," Selene said. "Near the front, where a pulpit might have stood." Adira and Silas moved carefully across the creaking floor. Some boards were rotten, threatening to give way under even their light weight. They knelt near the front and began prying up planks with a metal rod Selene provided. Dirt. More boards. A snake that slithered away into shadow. "Here," Silas whispered. Beneath a layer of loose soil, his fingers had found metal. They dug carefully, revealing a tin lockbox about the size of a book. It was rusted at the edges, but intact. A simple latch held it closed. Adira's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside lay a journal bound in oiled cloth. The pages were filled with their mother's handwriting, neat, precise, unmistakable. But the words made no immediate sense. Symbols appeared beside names. Numbers followed routes, marked with codes. Diagrams showed waterways with notation Adira couldn't decipher. "She wrote all this," Silas breathed. Adira turned pages carefully. She saw names she recognized, plantation owners, overseers, traders. She saw references to cargo that wasn't cargo, routes that weren't routes. She saw dates and locations and symbols that appeared repeatedly throughout the journal. Pride swelled in her chest. Her mother had been part of something larger, something organized and deliberate. This wasn't random kindness. This was intelligence work, strategy, resistance. But grief followed immediately after. Her mother had been sold because of this work, torn away, used as punishment and warning. "Let me see," Selene said quietly. Adira handed over the journal reluctantly. Selene studied the pages, her expression growing more troubled with each one she examined. When certain names appeared, she looked away quickly, as though the words physically hurt. "What do the symbols mean?" Adira asked. "Safe houses," Celine said, "marked by specific plants or arrangements. This one," she pointed to a recurring mark, "means abolitionists. This other one means danger, patrols, informants. And these," Silas pointed to a series of numbers, "distances, times, schedules for when areas are least guarded." Adira watched Celine's face carefully. The woman's hands shook slightly. Her eyes wouldn't meet theirs directly. "You recognize some of these names," Adira said. It wasn't a question. Celine closed the journal slowly. "We should leave. Take this somewhere safer before we study it further." They departed the church as afternoon light slanted through the trees. The humidity had become oppressive, making every breath feel insufficient. They traveled toward what Celine described as safer marsh pockets, areas too difficult for large search parties to navigate effectively. By evening, they'd reached a small rise surrounded by shallow water on three sides. Celine built a careful fire using dry wood that produced minimal smoke. They ate cold cornbread and dried berries, conserving their supplies. The journal sat between them like something alive and dangerous. Finally, as darkness settled completely, Celine spoke. "I need to tell you the truth." Adira felt her stomach tighten. "Months ago," Celine continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "men came to my home. They knew I sometimes helped people moving through the swamp. They threatened my daughter. Said they'd take her if I didn't provide information." Silas had gone very still. "They asked about your mother, about her movements, about who she met." Celine's hands twisted together. "I told them small things, times she passed through, directions she traveled. I convinced myself it was nothing important, nothing that would lead to her capture." "But it did," Adira said flatly. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know they were building a case against her. I thought they just wanted to track patterns, to understand roots." Selena's voice broke. "When I learned she'd been sold, that the cartel had orchestrated it as punishment." "You got our mother caught," Silas interrupted. Tears streamed down his face. "You betrayed her." "I protected my own child," Celine said. "I made a choice. I've regretted every day since. When I found you in the swamp, I saw a chance to make amends, to help Marianne's children the way I failed to help her." Adira stood up abruptly. She walked to the edge of their small camp, staring out into darkness. Her mind reeled with the information. Celine had seemed kind, genuinely caring, but she'd also contributed to their mother's capture, to their family's destruction. "How do we know you're not still working for them?" Adira asked, without turning around. "You don't," Celine admitted. "I can only show you through actions, through risk, through sacrifice, if necessary." "That's not good enough," Adira said. Silas was crying harder now, his thin shoulders shaking. The sight of his grief made Adira's chest ache, but she couldn't comfort him. Not yet. She felt too raw, too angry, too confused. The fire burned lower. Celine added no more wood, letting it die naturally. She settled onto the ground at the camp's edge, deliberately positioning herself away from the children, giving them space. Hours passed. Celine's breathing eventually deepened into sleep, though Adira suspected it might be pretend sleep, a way to avoid further confrontation. Adira returned to where Silas lay curled on his side, still awake despite his exhaustion. She sat beside him, pulling the journal onto her lap. "What are you doing?" Silas whispered. "Memorizing it," Adira said. "Every symbol, every code, every route marker, in case we lose it, in case we can't trust anyone but ourselves." She opened to the first page and began studying by the dying firelight. The symbols swam before her eyes at first, but she forced herself to focus, to categorize, to remember. Silas watched her for a while, then moved closer. resting his head against her shoulder. "Do you think Mama knew?" he asked. "That Selene betrayed her?" "I don't know," Adira said honestly. "Do you think she'd want us to forgive Selene?" "I don't know that either." The fire collapsed into embers, glowing faintly in the darkness. Adira continued studying the journal, committing patterns to memory the way she'd once memorized guard rotations and drainage routes. Knowledge was survival. Information was power. Around them, the swamp sang its night chorus. Somewhere distant, a night bird called. The water lapped against their small island of higher ground, and between the three of them, 2 children and 1 guilt-haunted woman, hung silence thick with distrust, grief, and the terrible weight of impossible choices. Dawn arrived without fanfare. The sky shifted from black to gray to pale blue, revealing a world made of mist and shadow. Adira had barely slept. She'd spent most of the night studying the journal by dying firelight, committing symbols and roots to memory, until her eyes burned and her head ached. Now she packed their meager supplies with mechanical movements. The journal went into her pouch first, wrapped carefully in the oiled cloth. She touched it frequently, reassuring herself it was still there. Selene moved quietly on the other side of their small camp. She rolled up blankets and extinguished the last embers of their fire. Her movements were deliberate, almost apologetic, as though she understood that trust had been shattered and couldn't be rebuilt through simple gestures. Silas sat between them, his face still swollen from crying. He ate a piece of dried fish without speaking, chewing slowly and staring at nothing. "We should move," Selene said quietly. "The hunters sweep in patterns. They'll reach this area soon." Adira nodded but didn't look at her. She helped Silas to his feet, checking that his makeshift shoes, cloth wrapped around his feet and tied with vine, were secure. The cuts from yesterday had scabbed over, but walking would still hurt. They set off through the marsh as morning light strengthened. The path Selene chose was narrow, forcing them to move single file along a corridor of cypress knees and dense undergrowth. Water reached their ankles, sometimes their calves. The air grew humid quickly, trapping heat close to the earth. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were their breathing, the splash of footsteps, and the constant chorus of insects and birds that filled every marsh morning. Adira kept one hand on the pouch containing the journal. Her mother's work, her mother's sacrifice, everything they needed to understand the larger mission that had cost their family so much. By mid-morning, the first sounds of pursuit reached them. Distant at first, the clatter of hooves on harder ground somewhere beyond the marsh's edge, splashing water as multiple people moved through shallows, voices calling to each other, coordinating their sweep. Selene stopped abruptly. "They're closer than I expected. We need to move faster." But faster proved impossible. The mud had thickened with the morning heat, sucking at their feet with each step. What should have taken minutes stretched into agonizing, slow progress. Adira's legs burned from the effort of pulling free with each stride. Then the dogs started barking. The sound was unmistakable. Hunting dogs, trained and focused. The barking grew louder, more insistent. Multiple animals, working together to track scent through difficult terrain. "Run!" Selene urged. "Don't worry about being quiet anymore. Just run." They tried. Adira grabbed Silas's hand, pulling him forward as they splashed through shallow pools and scrambled over fallen logs. Behind them, the barking intensified. Voices shouted commands. The pursuit was organizing, gaining ground. Silas's foot caught on a submerged root. He pitched forward with a cry, dragging Adira down with him. They hit the water hard, mud exploding around them. Adira felt the pouch slip from her shoulder. "No!" She lunged for it, but the current, stronger here than she'd realized, caught the pouch and pulled it toward deeper water. She dove after it, her fingers closing on empty water. The journal, wrapped in its oiled cloth, disappeared into a dark pool formed by a sunken tree trunk. Adira dove again, and again. Her hands searched blindly through murky water, finding only mud and roots and smooth river stones. The current had taken the journal somewhere she couldn't reach, somewhere beyond recovery. "Adira!" Silas grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "They're coming!" The dogs were close now, so close that individual barks could be distinguished. Human voices shouted back and forth, crashing through brush with the confidence of superior numbers. Selene appeared beside them, her expression desperate. She looked at Adira's empty hands, understanding immediately what had been lost. For a moment, grief flashed across her face, not just for the journal, but for everything it represented. Then her expression hardened with decision. "There," she pointed to a cluster of massive cypress roots forming a natural tunnel. "Crawl through. Stay low. Follow the roots until you reach clearer water. Then go north. North until you find the settlement with 3 white oaks standing together." "What about you?" Silas asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. Selene didn't answer. She pushed both children toward the root tunnel. "Go. Now." "Selene!" Adira started. "I failed your mother," Selene interrupted. Her voice was fierce, urgent. "I won't fail you. Get into that tunnel." Adira hesitated only a second longer. Then she grabbed Silas and pushed him into the narrow opening between the roots. The space was barely wide enough for their small bodies. They had to crawl on their bellies, pulling themselves forward with their arms. Behind them, Selene crashed deliberately through the brush in the opposite direction. She made as much noise as possible, snapping branches and splashing water loudly. "East!" she shouted. They went east. 2 runaways heading for the river crossing. Through gaps in the roots, Adira watched what happened next. Hunters emerged from multiple directions. Men with rifles, men with ropes, men with dogs straining against leather leads. They converged on Selene like a closing fist. "Where are they?" demanded a voice Adira recognized. Brant, the overseer from their plantation. "East!" Selene screamed again. "Past the fallen willow! They're heading for the crossing!" "She's lying," another voice said. "Check her." Hands grabbed Selene roughly. They bound her wrists with rope, pulling the knots tight enough to make her gasp. But even as they restrained her, she continued shouting misleading directions. "The girl has a journal. Stolen documents. They're taking it east to abolitionist contacts." "Shut her up," Brant ordered. Someone struck Selene across the face. She stumbled, but kept talking, kept directing attention away from the root tunnel where 2 children lay frozen in terror. "Search east. The trail's fresh. They can't have gone far." Half the hunters took her bait. They crashed away through the marsh, dogs baying as they followed the false trail Selene had created with her noise and misdirection. The remaining hunters dragged Selene in a different direction entirely, back toward their base camp. She fought them every step, struggling and shouting, buying seconds and minutes with her body and her voice. Then they were gone. The marsh fell quiet except for distant sounds of the hunters who'd been deceived. Adira forced herself to move. She pulled Silas deeper into the root tunnel, crawling until her arms shook and her knees bled from scraping against wood and stone. The tunnel seemed endless, a nightmare passage that went on and on. Finally, it opened into a section of marsh, where the water ran clearer and the light filtered through in golden shafts. They emerged carefully, listening for any sound of pursuit. Nothing. Only birdsong and wind through leaves. They walked for hours as afternoon faded toward evening. Neither spoke. There were no words adequate for what they'd witnessed, what they'd lost. By dusk, they found shelter beneath a massive fallen cypress trunk. The tree had collapsed years ago, creating a hollow space underneath where the ground stayed relatively dry. They crawled inside, too exhausted to go farther. Silas fell asleep almost immediately, his small body going limp against Adira's side. His breathing was shallow, but steady. Even in sleep, his hand clutched her arm tightly, as though afraid she might disappear if he let go. Adira stared out at the darkening marsh. Twilight turned everything purple and gray. Shadows lengthened and merged. The world became a place of uncertain shapes and fading light. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered. "I lost your journal. I lost the only proof of your work. I couldn't protect it." The words felt hollow, inadequate. She'd failed to safeguard the one thing that mattered most, the record of her mother's sacrifice and mission. And now Celine, despite her betrayal, despite everything complicated between them, had sacrificed herself to save them. Adira didn't know how to feel about that. Gratitude and anger twisted together in her chest, inseparable and confusing. She held Silas closer as full darkness arrived. Around them, the marsh settled into its night rhythms. Somewhere distant, an owl called. Water lapped against roots and stones, and in the hollow beneath the fallen tree, 2 children lay in the dark, alone and hopeless, convinced that everything they'd fought for had been stripped away. Dawn arrived without fanfare. No dramatic sunrise, no sudden warmth, just gradual lightening of the darkness, gray seeping into black until the world became visible again. Adira woke first. Her body ached everywhere, muscles stiff from sleeping on hard ground, cuts and scrapes from days of running, bruises from falling in the marsh. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow feeling in her chest. The journal was gone, their only guide, their mother's entire legacy, lost to muddy water and current. Celine was captured, the woman who'd betrayed their mother but sacrificed herself to save them. Adira still didn't know how to feel about that. Gratitude and resentment tangled together until she couldn't separate one from the other. She sat up carefully, trying not to wake Silas. Through the gap beneath the fallen cypress trunk, she could see marsh stretching in all directions. Morning mist hung low over the water, making everything look ghostly and uncertain. They had nothing now, no adult guide, no written instructions, no clear path forward, just 2 exhausted children in a swamp full of hunters. Silas stirred beside her. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the dim light. For a moment, he looked confused about where they were. Then memory returned, and his expression crumpled. "The journal's really gone?" he asked quietly. Adira nodded. Her throat felt too tight to speak. They sat together in silence as the marsh woke around them. Birds began calling. Insects resumed their endless buzzing. Water lapped against roots and stones with rhythmic patience. Silas drew patterns in the dirt with one finger. Circles and lines, symbols that looked familiar. Adira watched him for several minutes before speaking. "What are you drawing?" "The symbols from Mama's journal," Silas said. "The ones we looked at before we lost it. You remember them?" "Some of them." Silas continued drawing. This one appeared on every 3rd page, and this one was always near water root, and this one, he drew a more complex symbol. This one showed up 6 times near the word ridge. Adira stared at her brother. She'd known he was clever, that he noticed patterns others missed. But this was different. This was hope, when she'd thought all hope was gone. "Show me everything you remember," she said. They spent the next hour reconstructing what they could. Silas drew symbols in the dirt, while Adira tried to recall the maps she'd studied. Between them, they pieced together fragments of their mother's work. It wasn't complete. Huge gaps remained. But slowly, a partial picture emerged. "The ridge symbol," Adira said, pointing to one of Silas's drawings. "Celine mentioned a raised ridge before. She said it was safer than the lower marsh because it stays above water even in storms," Silas finished. "And Mama's journal marked it multiple times, which means the abolitionist route must follow the ridge." Adira felt something stirring in her chest. Not quite hope, but something close. Possibility. If we can find it, we might find the safe path north. It wasn't much. A fragment of a plan, built from memory and guesswork. But it was more than they'd had when they woke. They left the shelter of the fallen tree as the sun climbed higher. Adira led them northeast, following Silas's memory of the symbols and her own sense of rising ground. The terrain gradually changed as they walked. Less standing water, firmer earth beneath their feet, vegetation shifting from water plants to hardier growth. By mid-morning, they'd reached what had to be the ridge, a raised spine of land running through the marsh like a hidden road. Trees grew thicker here. The ground, while still damp, didn't sink beneath their weight. They followed the ridge carefully, staying alert for any sound of pursuit. The hunters hadn't found them yet, but that didn't mean they'd stopped searching. Then Silas grabbed Adira's arm. Look! Ahead, maybe 50 feet away, someone was struggling in the marsh just below the ridge. A young man, teenager really, half buried in what looked like quick mud. He'd ventured off the solid ground and gotten trapped in the sucking earth. Adira recognized him immediately. The teenage hunter from the boat they'd sabotaged. The son of the man who'd been searching for them. He hadn't seen them yet. He was too focused on his predicament, arms braced against the mud's surface, trying desperately not to sink deeper. His calls for help were weak, hoarse. He'd probably been trapped for hours. "We should go," Adira whispered, pulling Silas back. "Quietly, before he notices us." But Silas didn't move. He stared at the struggling teenager with an expression Adira had seen before, the same guilt-stricken look he'd worn after they heard the boat capsize. "We loosened his boat," Silas said quietly. "We made it harder for him. And now he's stuck because he chose to hunt children for money," Adira interrupted. "That's not our fault." "Maybe." Silas's voice was small but steady. "But what if he dies here? What if we leave him, and he just sinks?" Adira wanted to say it didn't matter, that their survival was more important than the life of someone trying to capture them. That compassion was a luxury they couldn't afford. But she looked at her brother's face and saw something that made her pause. Not just guilt, not just fear, something deeper. Silas was afraid of becoming the kind of person who could walk away from someone dying, even an enemy, even someone who wanted to hurt them. He was afraid that survival might cost them their souls. "If we help him," Adira said carefully, "he could call for the others, could grab us, could—" "I know." Silas met her eyes. "But we'd know we tried. We'd know we didn't let him die when we could have saved him." Adira looked at the struggling teenager, then at her brother, then back at the teenager. She made a decision that went against every survival instinct she'd developed. "Stay here," she told Silas. "Behind those trees. If anything goes wrong, run." She approached the quick mud carefully, testing each step before putting her weight down. The teenage hunter noticed her when she was about 15 feet away. His eyes widened, first with recognition, then with something more complicated. Shame, maybe, or resignation. "Don't," he said weakly. "Don't come closer. You'll get stuck too." Adira ignored him. She found a fallen branch, long and sturdy, and dragged it to the edge of the quick mud. "Grab this. We'll pull you out." "We?" The teenager looked past her and saw Silas emerging from the trees, carrying another branch to help distribute weight. For a moment, nobody moved. The tableau was absurd. Two escaped children offering rescue to someone hunting them for profit. Then the teenager grabbed the branch. Adira and Silas pulled. The mud released him slowly, reluctantly, with horrible sucking sounds. It took several minutes of sustained effort before he finally dragged himself onto solid ground. He lay there gasping, covered head to toe in dark mud. When he could finally speak, his voice was rough. "Why?" Adira didn't have a good answer. "Because we're not like the people who hunt us." The teenager stared at them both. His expression cycled through confusion, shame, and something that might have been respect. He stood slowly, testing his mud-caked legs. Then he pointed northeast, along the ridge. "Gap in the line," he said quietly. "Half-mile that way. Coverage is thin because most men were pulled south to follow a false trail someone gave them." He looked at Adira when he said, "false trail," and she understood. Celine's sacrifice was still protecting them, her shouted misdirection still buying them precious time. "Why tell us?" Silas asked. The teenager shook his head. "I don't know." He turned to leave, heading in the opposite direction, limping slightly. After a few steps, he looked back once. "I'll say I never saw you. I'll say the mud caught me, and nobody came by." Then he was gone, disappearing into the marsh's dense vegetation. Adira and Silas stood together in the morning light. Her heart was pounding, adrenaline still flooding her system. But beneath the fear was something else, something steadier. They'd chosen compassion over bitterness, humanity over revenge, and somehow, impossibly, it had worked. "Come on," Adira said, taking Silas's hand. "We need to reach that gap before anyone realizes he's missing." They continued along the ridge, moving faster now, hearts pounding but steadier than before. The marsh stretched endlessly around them, full of danger and uncertainty, but they held power to choose who they became. Even here, even now, even when surrounded by brutality and systems designed to crush them, that knowledge felt like armor, like hope, like something worth protecting as fiercely as their lives. The ridge ran like a secret road through the marsh. By midday, Adira and Silas had traveled far enough that the sounds of pursuit had faded to occasional distant echoes. The raised ground beneath their feet stayed firm, exactly as Silas's memory of their mother's symbols had promised. They stopped to rest beneath a cluster of tupelo trees. Silas pulled out a small collection of herbs he'd gathered during their walk: wild mint, crushed sweetgrass, and dried marsh marigold. He arranged them carefully on a flat stone. "What are you doing?" Adira asked. "The symbols," Silas said. Mama's journal showed herbs arranged in patterns. I think she used them as signals to other people helping runaways. Adira leaned closer. She remembered now, pages in the journal showing botanical sketches arranged in specific formations. At the time, she'd thought it was just documentation. But Silas was right. They were codes. "Show me." Silas drew in the dirt with a stick, recreating the patterns from memory. This one meant safe path ahead. This one meant danger, avoid. And this one, he drew a more elaborate design. This one meant help nearby. Adira studied the symbols, her mind working rapidly. What if we used them wrong on purpose? Wrong? Place them in locations that lead hunters away from us. Make them think the safe paths are somewhere else entirely. Understanding lit Silas's face. Create false trails that look real. They spent the next hour gathering herbs and arranging them in careful patterns along paths branching away from the ridge. Adira crushed mint leaves and scattered them near a flooded basin to the east. Silas placed sweetgrass formations pointing south toward thick brambles. Each arrangement mimicked their mother's code, but directed anyone following them toward obstacles and dead ends. The work was delicate, precise. They had to make the symbols look authentic, weather-worn but still recognizable. Too perfect would raise suspicion. Too messy would be ignored. By early afternoon, they'd planted 6 false signals across different paths. Then they returned to the ridge and continued north, being careful to disturb as little vegetation as possible. The real trick came when they reached a section where shallow water pooled on both sides of the ridge. Adira remembered a technique Celine had taught them, creating mirrored footprints. She stepped carefully into the water on the eastern side, leaving clear prints in the soft mud beneath. Then she walked backward in her exact footprints, balancing on logs and exposed roots to avoid creating a second trail. The result looked like someone had walked east and disappeared. Silas did the same on the western side, creating an identical illusion. "Now they'll think we split up," Silas said. "Or that we're traveling in groups," Adira added. "Either way, they have to divide their search." They continued north along the ridge, using every technique they'd learned. Where the path forked, they left contradictory signs. Where solid ground met water, they arranged footprints pointing in multiple directions. They broke branches at angles that suggested passage, but led nowhere. They disturbed vegetation in patterns that mimicked flight, but circled back on themselves. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. Sweat soaked their clothes. Mosquitoes swarmed around them in clouds, but they kept working, kept creating their web of false trails and misleading signals. By late afternoon, they heard the first confirmation that their tactics were working. Voices carried across the marsh. Angry, confused voices. A search group arguing about which direction to follow. Dogs barking from multiple locations simultaneously, pulling their handlers in conflicting directions. "The trail splits here," one voice shouted. "No, it's a false sign," another argued. "Look at how the grass is bent. Nobody actually walked this way." "The dogs smell something," a third voice insisted. The argument grew more heated. Adira and Silas crouched low on the ridge, listening as the search group fractured. Some men went east, others west. A few stayed behind, convinced all the trails were false and that the children must still be nearby. Throughout the rest of the afternoon, they heard similar confusion echoing across the marsh. Hunter groups calling to each other, sharing contradictory information, arguing about the evidence they'd found. The massive manhunt was splintering into smaller, ineffective searches that wasted time and energy chasing ghosts. The children kept moving north, always north. As evening approached, the ridge widened into firmer ground. Trees grew thicker here, their canopy providing shelter from the setting sun. The air smelled different, wood smoke and cooking food. Faint, but unmistakable. Civilization. Hidden and small, but real. They proceeded cautiously until they saw it. A small settlement of cabins built on raised platforms, nearly invisible beneath the heavy tree cover. Smoke from cooking fires dissipated into the canopy, barely visible. Narrow walkways connected the structures, all built to leave minimal ground disturbance. A settlement of free black families, living in deliberate secrecy. An elderly woman noticed them first. She was grinding herbs outside one of the cabins, her hands steady and practiced. She didn't seem surprised to see two mud-covered children emerging from the marsh. Instead, she looked at the way they approached, following the ridge exactly, disturbing nothing unnecessarily. Then she looked down at a patch of crushed herbs near the settlement's edge, arranged in a specific pattern, the "Help Nearby" symbol. One Silas must have placed hours ago without Adira noticing. "You carry Marianne's knowledge," the woman said quietly. It wasn't a question. Adira nodded, too exhausted for elaborate explanation. The woman set down her grinding stone. "Come. Quickly now, before the patrols pass this way again." She led them to a hidden cabin set deeper into the settlement. Inside, other families were gathered, adults and children, all watching the newcomers with cautious hope. The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Esther, explained quickly what the children had done. "They fractured the manhunt," Esther said. "Used false trails and mirrored signs to split the search groups into confusion." Murmurs of approval circulated through the cabin. Someone brought bowls of warm stew, the first hot meal Adira and Silas had eaten in days. Someone else brought clean water and cloths to wash the marsh mud from their skin. Esther sat with them while they ate. "We're part of a chain," she explained quietly. "A network that moves people north, past the places where hunters can follow. We received word days ago that Marianne's children might be coming. We've been watching for the signs." "How did you know?" Adira asked. "Marianne sent messages before she was taken." Told us to watch for two clever ones who might remember her teachings. Esther smiled faintly. She didn't expect you to improve upon those teachings. The false trails. That was your own innovation. They finished eating while Esther outlined the plan. Tomorrow night, they'd be moved to the next station along the Underground Railroad. From there, they'd travel in stages, hidden in wagons, guided through forests, transported along rivers that flowed north toward freedom. But tonight, they would rest. The settlement's sentries kept watch through the evening. Once, around midnight, hunters passed close enough that their lanterns flickered through the trees. But the false trails Adira and Silas had planted sent them searching miles to the east, convinced the children had headed toward the river deltas. The hunters' frustrated shouts faded into the distance. Adira and Silas slept that night in actual beds, under actual roofs, surrounded by people who had chosen to risk everything to help them. For the first time since their mother's sale, they slept without fear of immediate capture. When they woke before dawn, Esther was already preparing for their departure. The settlement couldn't shelter them longer, too dangerous for everyone involved. But they'd done what was needed, provided rest, food, and the next link in the chain. Under the cover of darkness just before moonrise, Esther led the children to a hidden inlet where a river skiff waited. The boat was small, disguised with marsh grass and branches to look like floating debris. "Stay low," Esther instructed. "The current will carry you north through the night. By morning, you'll reach the next station. They'll be watching for this boat." Adira and Silas climbed into the skiff. It rocked slightly beneath their weight, but held steady. Esther pushed them off from the bank, and the current caught them gently, pulling them into the main channel. Behind them, across the vast marsh they'd crossed, distant lanterns still flickered, hunters still searching, still confused by the trails that led nowhere, and the signs that contradicted each other. 100 bounty hunters, and none of them could find two children who'd learned to turn knowledge into freedom. The skiff drifted north under moonlight. Adira kept one hand on the side of the boat, the other holding Silas close. The water moved beneath them with quiet purpose, carrying them toward safety 1 silent mile at a time. 3 weeks later, Adira and Silas stepped down from a wagon onto solid ground that felt impossibly still beneath their feet. After weeks of constant movement, hidden compartments in carts, midnight walks through forests, river crossings under heavy blankets, the absence of motion felt strange. They stood at the edge of a small settlement near the St. Lawrence River in Canada. The air was different here, cooler, cleaner, free from the thick humidity of Louisiana swamps. Water stretched endlessly before them, vast and calm, reflecting the gray-blue of early morning sky. "This way," said the woman who'd guided them on the final leg of their journey. Her name was Ruth, and she'd spoken little during the trip, keeping watch instead, but her presence had been steady, reassuring. She led them toward a cluster of cabins overlooking the water. The buildings were simple but well-maintained, with smoke rising from chimneys and gardens growing near each doorway. People moved about their morning tasks, carrying water, tending fires, feeding chickens, living ordinary lives that seemed extraordinary after everything the children had survived. Adira held Silas's hand as they walked. Her brother had grown quieter during the journey, processing everything they'd experienced. Sometimes at night, he'd wake gasping from dreams of hunters or sinking boats. But each morning, he'd rise and continue forward, trusting the chain of strangers who passed them northward like precious cargo. Ruth stopped before a cabin set slightly apart from the others. "She's inside," Ruth said simply. "We brought her here 2 weeks ago." Adira's heart hammered against her ribs. 2 weeks ago. Her mother had been here for 2 weeks while they were still traveling. So close, yet separated by miles and careful timing. Ruth knocked twice, then opened the door. The cabin's interior was dim after the bright morning light. Adira's eyes adjusted slowly, making out a simple room with a table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and a cot against the far wall. Then movement, a figure rising from one of the chairs. Marianne stood there, backlit by the window. She looked thinner than Adira remembered, her face more lined, her hair streaked with new gray, but her eyes, when they locked onto her children, blazed with recognition and disbelief. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Marianne dropped to her knees on the wooden floor, arms opening wide. Adira and Silas ran to her. The embrace was immediate, crushing, desperate. Marianne pulled both children against her chest, one arm wrapped around each of them, holding so tightly it almost hurt. She was crying, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. "I thought you were gone," Marianne whispered into their hair. "I thought I'd lost you both forever." Adira couldn't speak. Her throat closed around words that wouldn't form. She buried her face in her mother's shoulder and let herself cry for the first time since the escape began. All the fear she'd held back, all the responsibility she'd carried, all the impossible choices, it poured out in shaking sobs. Silas cried too, quieter, but just as deeply. His small hands clutched at Marianne's sleeves as though afraid she might disappear if he let go. They stayed like that for a long time. Ruth quietly closed the door, leaving them alone. Eventually, Marianne pulled back just enough to look at their faces. She touched Adira's cheek with trembling fingers, then Silas's. "You're real," she said, voice breaking. "You're both real and here and safe." "We found your journal," Adira managed, "in the church. Celine helped us." Marianne's expression shifted, pain and gratitude mixing together. "Celine," she repeated softly. "Is she—" "She was captured," Silas said quietly. "She sacrificed herself so we could escape." Marianne closed her eyes briefly, grief passing across her features. When she opened them again, tears still fell, but she nodded. That sounds like something she would do. She carried so much guilt about what happened to me. "She told us," Adira said, "about how they forced her to give information." "She protected her own children first," Marianne said firmly. "I never blamed her for that. I only wish she could have known I made it out too." She stood slowly, keeping one hand on each child's shoulder, as though needing the physical contact to believe they were truly there. "How did you escape? How did two children outrun an entire manhunt?" Over the next hours, they told her everything. They sat at the small table while Marianne prepared tea with shaking hands, and the children recounted their journey, the tunnel beneath the sugar mill, the tripwires that failed, the ferryman's news about the massive bounty, Celine's training in the swamps. Adira described the lockbox and the journal's contents, how they'd studied the symbols and routes by firelight. She explained losing it during the hunter sweep, the awful feeling of watching it sink beyond reach. Silas told about the teenage hunter trapped in quick mud, and how they'd chosen to save him despite their fear. How that single act of compassion had opened a gap in the encirclement. Marianne listened to every word, her expression moving through shock, pride, pain, and wonder. When they described the false trails and mirrored footprints, how they'd fractured the 100-hunter search into confused splinters, Marianne actually laughed through her tears. "You took what I taught you and made it stronger," she said quietly. "You became something I never imagined possible." "We were so scared," Adira admitted. "Every single day." "Fear doesn't mean you weren't brave," Marianne said. "Bravery is being terrified and moving forward anyway. You did that. Both of you." She explained her own escape then, how the same network that saved the children had intercepted her transport wagon 3 days after the sale, how she'd traveled north through the same chain of stations, always asking if anyone had seen 2 children matching their description, how she'd arrived here believing her family was shattered forever. "I prayed," Marianne said simply. "I prayed you'd somehow find a way. But I didn't truly believe it was possible." That evening, They ate supper together at the small table. The meal was simple: bread, broth, dried fruit. But it was the first time in weeks that any of them had eaten without fear. No rushing, no hiding, no listening for approaching footsteps. They were together. They were free. They were safe. Over the following days, the family began settling into the rhythm of the settlement. The community welcomed them quietly, asking no questions about their past, offering only support for their present. Adira and Silas met other families who'd traveled similar paths. Children who'd escaped with parents. Parents who'd escaped alone, hoping to find their children later. Elderly people who'd walked hundreds of miles for one final taste of freedom before death. The settlement's organizers quickly recognized the children's unique knowledge. Their understanding of swamp navigation, false trail creation, and coded symbols proved invaluable for helping newly arrived refugees. Marianne worked with the settlement's record keepers, helping restore and expand their collection of route documentation. One afternoon, she brought Adira a blank journal, new pages waiting to be filled. "Write what you remember," Marianne said gently. "Everything you learned, the tactics that worked, the mistakes that taught you. Other children will need this knowledge someday." Adira held the journal carefully, feeling its weight. She thought about Celine, about the teenage hunter, about the 100 searchers who'd underestimated 2 children barely taller than cane stalks. That twilight, she sat beside Silas on the cabin's small porch, overlooking the river. The water reflected the orange and purple of sunset, calm and endless. Marianne sat behind them, mending a torn shirt, humming softly. Adira opened the journal to its first blank page. She dipped a borrowed pen in ink and began to write, speaking the words aloud as Silas watched. "We were hunted by 100, but we learned to see in the dark. We found each other again, and now we help others find their way." Silas leaned against her shoulder, reading the words as they formed. "That's good," he said quietly. Adira continued writing, documenting their journey while memory was still fresh. The tunnel, the tripwires, the marsh training, the symbols, the moment when hope had seemed lost, and they'd chosen compassion instead of bitterness. Behind them, Marianne's humming continued, a soft, steady sound that filled the evening air with peace. The river stretched before them, flowing endlessly northward. Its surface remained calm, reflecting the deepening sky. No hunters searched its banks. No dogs barked in pursuit. No chains waited in hidden wagons. Just water, moving quietly toward horizons they could now choose for themselves. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.